Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Issues and Insights. I'm Jarrett Cox and we have a fantastic show for you today. Fire. It's bad. Hopefully you know that, but if you don't, then the next 30 minutes is going to tell you all about that. And we have a great guest for that topic. We have Tommy Crane, the Deputy Fire Marshal for the City of Radcliff. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So I want to kind of zoom out to start off with, because firefighters, people think of them, traditionally, fire hydrants, the hose, putting out house fires. But that's not all that you do, especially in smaller towns.
No, today's firefighters, we have a lot more responsibility. Some of that has been just, like we were talking before the show, how a lot of communities, especially if it's a more rural community, rely heavily on their firefighters just because of being able to respond. And the fire service, like I said, we've taken on a lot more tasks. Even in career or paid departments, there are a lot more things that we do beyond just fighting fires. We do hazardous material stuff. We do specialized rescues. And sometimes that has become as a result of something that has happened and realizing there was a need, and we kind of get tasked with that. There's a lot of positivity out of that, because we are usually there's somebody there to respond. The response time is usually quicker. When shortly after I first started several years ago. But we started taking on making when AEDs became a thing. That we started taking on those duties of responding more with medical runs. That was something that we started doing because we could a lot of times get there if an ambulance was tied up or something like that. We could get there pretty quick. And
I would imagine with Narcan and EpiPens that's only increased.
Yes. With a lot of the drug issues, that is our response is really increased, and so you can even look at it as, if you look at the size of, we have our first fire truck that the city purchased in 1956, and if you put it next to our current first out truck, it's like 3 times the size of the original truck. Just the immensity of everything that we have to put on the vehicle. The first truck only carried 2 to 3 people. Now we can carry 5 people. Actually, some trucks can carry more than that. We carry a lot more water. So there's a lot of different things, a lot more tools. Extrication. We can get there. We can, get people out of the vehicles in an emergency and get them into the ambulance, and so they can. We know that time is of the essence in a vehicle accident. So there's a lot of things that we've taken on. And then other roles such as fire prevention, just trying to, go from business to business to the schools and places where there's a lot of people that assemble, churches and stuff. So we try to make sure that those areas are safe, restaurants and things, because we've just through the years we've, understood that, what we can do to try to prevent it versus trying to fight the fires. We try to get out to the schools and educate and talk to the kids about what they can do, and they take that information a lot of times to their parents, and making sure the smoke alarms are working and things like that.
And they have batteries.
Right, they have batteries. Technology has helped immensely. There's a lot of things with smoke alarms that they're a lot more efficient, a lot better. But yeah, so we do have a lot more responsibility, but. It is a job that it's rewarding, to know that that you're doing something that is helping your neighbor, and plus I get paid to do something that I enjoy. So
right, and we were talking before the show started that I live in Coburn. It's a small town. We have a Family Dollar. That's all we've got.
There you go.
But we have a volunteer fire department, and for almost anything, ambulance service in Muffordville is 20 minutes away, and Litchfield, the other county next door, is 20 minutes away. So your firefighters are the person that you're going to see first. And the firehouse is right next to the school. So, for us kids, we saw the fire department a lot. We knew our firefighters, and we're very thankful, especially for them being volunteers, that they volunteered their time to do this.
Yes. Yeah, it is very rewarding. Like I said, being able to do that. There is a lot more training that goes with it than previous years, but once again, there's just a lot more that we're tasked with, and that we're trying to, like everybody else, we're trying to do more with a lot of times less, as far as people and stuff, it seems like. But it is something that we want to keep trying to move forward, and we're always trying to learn, see what the new technology is, and like I said, constantly trying to educate people and help them to see that something small could prevent them from an accident or a fire.
So I'm glad you said something small, because one of the first things we'll talk about is spring cleaning. A lot of people don't realize it. The smallest thing, maybe a little charger that you may not think of, the charger's phone, can cause a house fire.
Right. Just on spring cleaning, we talk to people about just making sure a lot of things that you take for granted. Your refrigerator. They have an electric motor in there, and that motor is always working and trying to to make the refrigerator cool, and the freezers. And so sometimes the dust and stuff will get built up behind them. So you always want to make sure when you can, just kind of clean behind them periodically, making sure that your dryer, most lint goes outside, but there is or gets caught in the lint filter. But sometimes over time the lint will build up around the motor and around the back of the dryer. The other thing too is a lot of times washers and dryers are in like a utility room, and sometimes that room is used for different storage and things. Is to try to keep that dryer clear of stuff. Clear of everything from Walmart, Kroger grocery bags that are made of plastic and very thin. So try to keep them away. A lot of times people like set them on top of the dryer, or things will get caught behind the dryer or beside the dryer. Constantly, make sure every time you're drying a load of clothes, clean that filter out. That's something easy to do. Just clean it out when you're switching out loads of laundry. When you can, try to vacuum down inside, past the filter. If in the first part of the year, maybe the end of the year, pull the dryer out and clean the hose or the exhaust pipe, and then even check where it goes outside of the house. That damper out there, it helps helps it flow better. It helps the dryer work more efficiently, but it also keeps rodents and things like that out of your from getting in there. We found birds' nests, wasp nests. They get in there, and occasionally it will get clogged as well. Sometimes people will put the guards on there to keep insects and animals out, and sometimes those guards will get clogged with the lint. So just take that time to make sure everything's clean, it's functioning, the airflow is good, so that it doesn't build up and cause a fire there. Just make sure you're talking about cords. Make sure how things are plugged in the house. We were talking a big thing with like charging cords. They're very thin. They're very they're easy. They over time you bend them in a certain way and they'll flex, and over time the insulation can crack, exposing the wires. Or we were talking about how there was actually a fire where the charging cord had gotten caught in a drawer of a dresser, and since they're so thin, it got damaged pretty easily. And so that's something to think about. And we're using chargers for everything, for phones, computers, and a lot of those cords are, like I said, are very thin, and they still carry enough electricity that they can start a fire. So it doesn't have to be a real big, thick extension cord to carry. That small amount of electricity can still start a fire. And so that's something to think about. Making sure where those chargers are, they're not covered up with any kind of combustibles, with a pillow. Don't put your phone by your, and then cover it up with your pillow, at your bed. Make sure that, if it's behind furniture, that furniture doesn't get pushed against it and damage the cord. Even a larger cord can get damaged, like if a couch, I've seen where, somebody's plugged in a lamp or something behind a couch, and the couch or chair gets shoved against it and bends the cord. I've seen it damage an outlet, and I've also seen it damage the cords and the plugs. So those are things to think about, as you're going through, cleaning your house, and doing that spring cleaning, getting ready for yard sales and stuff like that. Just check those things, and it's very important. It's something that could take time. Some people think, well, I've lived in my house for 20 years and nothing's happened. well, over time something could be happening that you don't realize. So that damaged cord could be causing problems later on. Check, we're talking about smoke alarms, check your smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, vacuum them periodically. Make sure that your smoke alarms are 10 years or less, they're 10 years or newer. We're talking about changing batteries. A lot of the newer ones have lithium batteries so that they will actually, once you put them on the base plate, they actually activate like a timer. And so at the end of 10 years, it'll beep to let you know that it's time to just take the whole thing down. Carbon monoxide detectors, some of them are around 7 years, some of them are about 10 years. It'll say on the back of it. Same way, they've got a little alarm that sets, after that time limit, they're supposed to chirp. And even if you change the batteries, they're going to chirp again. So,
and normally on carbon monoxide detectors, another one at our house that has a place that you write the date that you install it.
Yes.
So you just check that and just make sure, it's not 10 years since you put that in.
Yeah. So, and you can check a lot of times it's on the back of the plate too, where it hangs on the wall. So you can check that. But yeah, and then change your batteries. Spring, we had the time change. I tell people either change them in the spring or fall when you're changing the clock. I always change mine in the fall, but I have several now. They have the 10 year, so and we can mark on the side of it too that with the like in a Sharpie, what year we put them in and when they're supposed to be changed.
How often do you advise somebody to check just check to make sure that it's working and the batteries are good on it? That hit that button to make it beep.
Ideally, once a month. You can and if it's on the ceiling or something. Usually the button is in a spot where you could take like a broom handle or something and push on it. When I go do building inspections and I'm checking like lights and smoke alarms and stuff, I have like a walking stick that I bought at Walmart, and you can extend it, and the end of it's usually small enough you can push it, and even the smaller buttons. So once a month is the best, and then just make sure you're listening to it to beep. Some of them you push them and once you push it, you just let it go and it'll cycle through on its own. Some of them you push it and you have to hold it for a few seconds to let it go through the cycle. But you definitely want to make sure that you want it to be loud and you want it so it'll wake everybody up.
So one thing I did want to briefly touch on, because we had that storm that blew through Kentucky, generators.
Yeah.
I know this, and I'm sure most people know this, but you do not have a gas-powered generator in your house.
Correct. Yeah. Anything that's going to produce fumes or carbon monoxide is a byproduct of anything that where you're using propane or gasoline or diesel or anything like that, or even a charcoal grill. So all of that is going to produce carbon monoxide, and the exhaust is going to build up. So yeah, don't even put it in your garage. Even if you've got the garage door open and you're like, it's got plenty of, because it can still get in through, like say, the kitchen door or wherever that door is going into the house. We recommend even keeping it, like if when you put it outside, even keep it about 15 to 20 feet away from the house possibly, so that the wind doesn't blow it in through the window. Like if you've got like a cord running through an open window or something, you don't want that wind to push it in there, and then it might get trapped inside the house. So yeah, definitely try to keep them away from the house even, and so that the fumes don't go inside and build up, and over time could cause a problem. But yeah, definitely do that. Make sure if when you're refueling them, make sure to turn them off and let them kind of cool a little bit, just like any other gasoline engine, small gasoline engine like that. But yeah, just try to keep all that stuff outside. And on generators, another thing is, we're talking about electrical, is making sure that the cords you use are good, solid cords, that they're rated for, if you've got to plug something in that might pull a lot of power. You don't want to use like a little tiny cord that will overheat and then cause a fire potential there as well.
Okay, so you mentioned grills, and you don't want to grill inside, or you don't want to grill inside either. So what are some other tips for, especially now it's this time of year, you want to start grilling out steaks, stuff? Oh yeah,
I mean, I know some people that will grill like year round. I mean, it can be snow on the ground, and grilling it really tastes good.
My dad is guilty of that.
Yeah. I mean, it tastes good and it's great to do. But we tell people, keep the grill about 10 feet away from the house. And that includes even like anything that overhangs. Like maybe you've got a patio that's got a roof that comes out. Preferably keep them off of like wood decks, things like that. But yeah, whether it's gas or charcoal. Now, another thing to remember too, before you run out and buy that really big, nice Blackstone grill, is if you're living in an apartment building, you cannot have grills on your decks or your balconies, because if something happens, you have to remember it's not just your family. There could be three other families or more, depending on the size of the apartment building. So so if you've got it, if you're on the first floor, a lot of times you can pull it away from the building. But if you're on a second or third floor or higher, you just can't do it, because we know you're not going to take that big grill down steps every time you're going to grill. So you can't use them or store them on the decks and balconies. In your homes or other places, just make sure that you're keeping it away from the building. If it's a charcoal grill, any grill, whether it's charcoal or propane, when you get it out for the beginning of the year, just check and make sure it's in good shape. A lot of times if they sit outside, they're going to rust, they get wobbly. You don't want it to fall over. You don't want the kids or the dogs, to come running around and knock it down.
And that would be one of the dangers of having it on the second floor of an apartment building.
Right, yeah. If somebody knocked it over, the coals fall out. And we actually had this one time. The grill got knocked over and the coals burned through the deck of the first floor and actually burned through the deck or the second floor and then onto the first floor below it and burned that deck as well. So people don't think about that there is that danger. Propane grills, take like a solution of soapy water and spray and make sure the hose, the connections aren't leaking. You don't want it to be leaking while you're cooking. That would be bad. Be careful with what you're lighting it with. So use charcoal. Only use approved lighter fluid. Make sure that if it's propane, use they've got if the igniter's not working, there's a hole in the side you can use a match, a longer match to put in there. So there's ways to do it properly. But yeah, if you turn your propane grill on, you smell gas or you hear it leaking and it's not going through the burners, then turn it off and clean the extra grease off your grill. That grease builds up over time and you risk having a flash fire that could cause a serious problem. You might have it closed grilling something and then you open the lid and it gets all that fresh oxygen and it'll actually flash on you. So those are some things to think about. And then, like I said, make sure that keep kids and pets away from them. Even after you're done, you got to remember it's going to have that residual heat. Let your coals cool before you try to dispose of them. Don't put them in the trash can. Don't throw them off to the side of your yard where there's some brush that you could start a brush fire or something. So those are things to remember on grills.
Speaking of brush fires, I know that this is a thing you see, especially around this time of year. I've seen this on the local Bowling Green news, since that's the closest news outlet to me. Burn notices.
Right.
So if there's a burn notice issued, first off, how would viewers find out about that?
The best way is, of course, a lot of times, the weather, the local weather will say something like yesterday. We had yesterday this week there was a red flag warning. It was high winds. It was real dry. Keep a lookout on the local news. They'll usually post it on there. Typically, most cities and counties now have a Facebook page or just a general web page that they'll post information on. So always check those. The radios, a lot of times we'll put stuff out through the radios, and just listen to those the media outlets and things like that, and we usually get that information out there, or like I said, online. Typically Facebook. Most every government entity has a Facebook page now, or some kind of web page that will try to post stuff and keep it up to date. Right.
Like I know in my county, it's usually the judge executive that says, no burning from this period to this period in the county.
Right. Typically, like what we do is we'll just follow what the state and the county does, and we'll just kind of go from there. We do have burning regulations in the city. Most cities do, just because of the close proximity. You're usually more spaced out in the county, but in the cities, because of usually having sewer systems and stuff, the houses are usually a lot closer. So there's things to think about there. The best thing to do is contact your local fire department and we'll let you know what you can and can't do. Typically, just like a recreational burn, like a small fire pit that you and your family enjoy, in the evening or something, the cool of the evening, that is typically approved. There again, just keep it about 20 feet away from your house so that you don't get it too close. We recommend trying to make, having a screen over it so the sparks and stuff, the embers don't fly around. But if it is a red flag or something like that, even then you can't burn, and you have to remember that any kind of burning is prohibited at that point. But typically a recreational fire is allowed because you're just using just basic wood, logs and stuff. That's the other thing, is watch what you're burning. The EPA actually has strict rules. You can't burn like construction lumber, construction materials, plastics, lumber that has paint on it or some kind of treatment. Just it has to be pretty much natural products nowadays. But like I said, if you have any questions, go ahead and call your local fire department, or usually the dispatch. The local dispatch will have information that they can get you in touch with somebody that can let you know what you can and can't burn.
And we'll put that on. We'll put that below at the bottom of the screen. That way, you know what numbers to call in your area.
Right.
But you talked about the recreation fires. Now, like I said, the storm happened recently, did a lot of damage, tore down a lot of trees. Obviously, I can't set all my trees on fire in my yard. So if I want to start a bigger fire, what do I need to do?
Well, there again, in the county, there's not as many restrictions. So what we always tell people is, there again, check. Before you do any kind of controlled burn like that, make sure that you call your the 911 dispatch, and like I said, they'll kind of let you know if there's a red flag or there's any restrictions as far as the county. The big thing is make sure you're far enough away from any large areas of trees, brush, wood lines, things like that, because you don't want it to spread. And then in the city, to get an actual burn permit, you'd have to contact the fire department, and we would come out and assess the situation. But the nice thing about most of the cities is that we have limb pickup. Like certain times of the year, like in Radcliff, there's 4 times of the year where they pick up just limbs, and they'll go around. In the fall, we do leaf pickup, so you're not having to worry about disposing of leaves. So those are things to think about as well. Benefits that I think of being in that jurisdiction is that you don't have to mess with all that. You just put it out by the street. Sometimes there are bigger projects, that obviously if you're clearing for construction, that may be something where we give you a burn permit pretty easy, because you're not going to be able to haul all that off cost effectively. But yeah, check with your local jurisdiction. When you are burning, stay with the fire, even if it's just a little fire pit. You stay with the fire. That's the most common thing we find is people will go off and leave it, and they won't make sure that it is done, and it'll spread. Watch the wind conditions. Wind can be a big factor in that. It can take a small fire, and especially if there's light stuff in it. The embers get lighter as they burn, and they'll float away. So if it's a real windy day, they can carry it a considerable distance and start another fire somewhere else. So those are things to think about when you're thinking about wanting to burn. But like I said, always check with the local jurisdiction to see what's allowed, so that you don't run into some issues there.
And one of the reasons you'd want to get a burn permit, first and foremost, is so the fire department knows. That way, in case neighbors call, oh God, there's something on fire, or if something goes out of control, the fire department already knows where they've authorized burn permits, so they already know the location.
Yes, yeah. So it is a tracking tool. Like in Radcliff, there's no charge for it. It's mainly just a tracking tool for us to make sure. And like I said, we go out there, we'll look at what you've got or what you're wanting to burn, and whether we can approve it or not. There's sometimes I have to be the bad guy and say, no, you can't. You'll have to find another way to dispose of it. But most of the time, if we know what you're doing, and sometimes people they'll call and once they realize that we do limb pickup or something like that, then they're good. They don't have to. But we'll try to work with you. But we also have to think of the safety of not just you, but all your neighbors. Because once again, you're living in close proximity to a lot of other people. And that fire that gets out of hand that was just a little grass fire in your yard could run into being a structure fire for the neighbor. So we don't want that. So we have to make sure that we take that seriously, and that we're not just trying to inconvenience you. We're trying to think of everybody's safety.
Right. So one of the things that I wanted to touch on, mainly because of fires and batteries, rechargeable batteries. Obviously, you don't want to burn those.
Right.
But
yes.
I know some people that do that and really shouldn't.
Yes, battery disposal is becoming a big concern because what we talked about before the show is rechargeable items are everywhere. Our phones, just about any device we have. All sorts of power tools now. I mean, we even use extrication tools that for years were only hydraulic because the battery power wasn't powerful enough. But we have batteries now for our extrication tools that are powerful enough to cut through the cars just like the hydraulic. So there are batteries everywhere, job sites, homes.
There's the new Ford truck, the new Ford electric truck has power outlets on the back that can charge your house.
Yes, I mean, they're everywhere. People are putting in recharging stations for their vehicles. So there's a lot to it. Some of the larger items like vehicle recharging is usually done professionally. But around your home, and the big one is, and rechargeable batteries have always had their safety concerns, but lithium has become the big one because it's not as temperature sensitive as some of the others. It carries a lot more power with it in a smaller space. So, but with that, there's also a lot of responsibilities. You want to make sure that look at your, make sure what you're using. It's real easy to go on Amazon and find something, and you just look at the price. Oh, hey, that battery's cheaper. But if the battery, you want to make sure that the battery has like an overload protection and a circuitry in there that will actually protect it from overcharging and heating up. If you do notice, if you've got a battery and you notice it's maybe it's starting to swell, it gets too hot, and it's or it even starts to leak or anything like that, you want to make sure to take it out of service, and make sure that you're not, continually using it because the danger is only going to increase. Make sure that, try to make sure your device is listed with, a reputable, company that has reviewed the device and made sure, like UL or FM Global, somebody who's actually looked at it and said this device is safe to use. You have to be cautious because some foreign approval companies would not meet the U.S. spec. Right. So that's something you have to think of that you run into sometimes. Yeah, it may be approved in China, but if you bring it over to the U.S., it's not going to be approved. It's not going to meet our standards.
And there's different voltage in different countries.
Yes, and that's another thing to think about. The same way talking about the voltage is make sure you're using the right charger. It'll say on there what you're supposed to charge it at, the voltage per hour, all that kind of stuff. So that information is on there. Now sometimes you might have to get a magnifying glass because but that information is on there, and make sure you're paying attention to that because you could be charging it with a charger that would actually put too much energy into it too quickly and cause it to overheat.
Thank you so much for coming here.
Thank you.
We wish we had more time, but there's a lot of great safety tips, and if you have any questions, always contact your local fire department.
Absolutely. That's what we're here for.
So, Tommy, thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for watching. For HCEC-TV, I'm Jarrett Cox. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you down the road.